Hello quilting friends. Well, today I wanted to show you how I make my flying geese units. This is going to be a method that uses what's called the no waste method. Actually, because I cut my pieces a little larger than needed, I do have a little bit of waste, but it's not too bad. Anyway, so what we're going to start with is our F and E squares here for this block, and I have mine cut there. I already have my lines marked on the back of my E squares. Usually when I do this, I lay out my larger square and then I place my two smaller squares on top, and then I draw my line. But I think I was tired this morning. I went ahead and drew all my lines first, but we're good, it all lines up. So doing it the other way just makes sure that my line is centered on all of the squares nicely, which it should be if I did it correctly. Anyway, so I have those laid out here, and now I'm going to take it over to my sewing machine and show you what to do next. Okay, so at my sewing machine, what I'm going to do is sew a 1/4 inch from each side of the drawn line. We've done that with a number of things now. Our half square triangles, it's the same process. One of the things I like to do when I'm sewing these is I like to have this top one facing towards me, away from my needle, because if I have it turned the other way, then as the needle approaches, it can bunch that up a little bit, so it just keeps that from happening. I'm just going to sew off onto a scrap piece of fabric here. Clip. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And I again have lined it up so that this is pointing towards me. It's a little bit different trying to sew with a camera sitting here in place, but I noticed on one of the other videos that it looked like I was not sewing lined up with the line, but as you can see, I'm a 1/4 inch from each side. It's just the angle I had to put the camera at can make it look a little off one way or the other. So just make sure that you're lined up. You're lined up with the edge of your 1/4 inch foot, and you'll be good to go no matter which side you sew from. Alrighty, now we just need to cut on that line that we drew. Looks like I need a bigger ruler. There we go. Just cut them apart. And then we'll take them and press them towards the triangles like that. Okay, now that you can see that I have pressed my triangles here, I'm going to turn it this direction, and we need to lay another one of the squares, which I've already drawn the line down, on top, lining up our corners here. And again, normally what I do is I don't have the line on there yet, I put the square on and then I draw my line onto the square, but since I've already done it, it's working just fine. And now I'm going to do the same thing. Sew on each side of the drawn line. Alright, so I'm ready to start sewing on the 1/4 inch from the line. I'll do my first one here. slow down as I'm going over this part because I've got this seam to go over, and just helps everything to go out nice and straight. Alright, and I'm going to go ahead and do my second one here. And I'll take a little scrap of fabric like I always do, sew off, clip these apart, and I'll turn them around and sew the other side. Alrighty, once again, I am just going to use my ruler and rotary cutter to cut these apart. And then once again we'll press the triangle, and there's the Flying Geese unit, and then we'll talk about how to trim it next. Now that I have all of my Flying Geese units pressed, it is time to trim them. And I really like these block lock rulers, but it turns out I do not have the correct finish size. I needed to have a 2x4 finish size, and I do not have that. But I wanted to show you how it just locks into place there on the seams. It has these little ridges, and you place it there, and then you would trim and then turn it around and lock everything in place, and then trim the last two sides, and you have the seam allowance built into your ruler. So those are really nice for trimming up Flying Geese units. Another ruler I really have come to appreciate is the Ultimate Flying Geese tool by Creative Grids. This one has multiple sizes, so a little more affordable when you're trying to purchase all the rulers you need. And this one, so I see my 2x4 finish size is marked there, so I know I'm going to use these lines here, and that little D is my top mark. So I'm going to line up my diagonal lines with my seam lines and make sure that point is right at the point of my Flying Geese right there, and this gives me the 1/4 inch that I need for the seam allowance. So I'll trim off the first two sides. One of the things that's kind of nice for this process is one of those rotating mats, but I did not pull that out for this. Okay, now I'm going to flip the ruler over where it says trim number 2, and I've got the 2x4 marks I'm going to line up with the edges of my unit that I just cut. The D goes again right there at the tip, and I can see that my diagonal lines are still lined up nicely, so I can trim the last two sides. And there's my Flying Geese unit. So what do you do if you don't have one of these special rulers and you're just going to use a regular ruler? Well, I'll show you that too. Well, this time I'm going to show you what to do if you have just a regular ruler for trimming your Flying Geese units. Now these units will need to be trimmed so that they're 4.5 by 2.5 in order to finish at our finish size of the 4x2 that we need for this quilt block. So I know that half of 4.5 is 2.25. So I find the 2.25 mark on my ruler, and my ruler's got a 1/4 inch seam line, that dashed line, which is awfully handy, and I'm going to put it right at the tip of my Flying Geese point. And then since I need this to be 2.5, I also need to look at the 2.5 inch mark, which on my ruler is right here. And I want that point to come right up to this diagonal seam line that's running here. And the same thing will happen with that 2.5 inch mark over here. It's a little hard to see on this ruler, so sometimes what I'll do is I'll line up a piece of paper there and see that I'm going to have a nice point where I trim. And then I can trim off these two sides. And I'll flip the block over. Get that little piece out of the way here. Okay, and then I'm going to line up. I've got my diagonal line that's on my seam line now, so I can get that in place where I need it. My 4.5 inch mark is going to go on this edge. My 2.5 inch mark is going to go on this edge. And then you can see that on my ruler the 1/4 inch, 2 1/4 inch is right there at that point again. I've got my diagonal line going nicely, so that means everything is ready to be trimmed. And there's my Flying Geese unit. So I'll just finish trimming the rest of them. The nice thing about the no waste method is I end up with 4 all ready to go, just needing trimming. So I hope that helps you in your process of making Flying Geese. And if you have any questions, always feel free to contact me, and I'll be happy to answer anything you might have to ask. Anyway, I hope you have fun quilting and wish you a happy day. Okay, I wanted to show you what can happen when my Flying Geese units do not come out perfectly. So I'm working with these same ones, and I have one here that you can see. If I line up my diagonal line for that 2x4 one, I am off about, by the time it gets down here, I'm off about 1/8 of an inch, but I'm off there. So what do I do? Because if I trim that, you know, even if I can center it, and which I will sometimes do, I'm just a little bit off on each side. That just means that my nice point here is going to be moved. It's not going to come to as sharp a point, which, with this little bit of difference, it's not a huge deal, but I can fix that if I want to, and in my perfectionist tendencies, I sometimes do that. So the trick I have come up with is to fold that one back down, the one that I sewed last, and then I line up my ruler against this seam line. It'll kind of bump up against it, and then push it up to my previous seam. And then I'll take my pencil and just mark a new line to sew on there. So then I'll take this over to my machine, sew on that new line, and show you how that works. So I've taken my unit over to the machine, and I've sewn right on that line that I drew previously, and you'll notice there's not much difference there. In fact, it is less than 1/8 of an inch difference. If I have more than that, if I'm off by closer to 1/4 of an inch, this method will not work, because when you go to trim it, you'll lose part of your block. So, but if you're just a little bit, like within 1/8 of an inch, this method will work well for you. And I'm going to go ahead and just trim this, just so I have a nice edge there. Okay, and then I'm going to press this and come back and show you. Actually, maybe I can just show you here roughly how this worked. So I can put my D in place now, and you can see that my diagonal lines now are matched up, and I can trim it, and it will be just perfect. I hope this helps in making your blocks, and happy quilting!